couple of things, and I know you're going to get tired of me hearing it. We're on Rumble. Please follow us, join us, like us, do all those things. We're actually even back on YouTube until they kick us off again. But again, my hope is that we get enough followers, enough people doing that, and if you go in and see those things, like us, whatnot, we'll be able to start making some money to be able to start affording to do this. We don't. The only income that we make is what goes into the jar right now. And so, if you're willing to help us and do whatever you can, that would be greatly appreciated. What you're seeing up here again is next July 4th is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And there's an effort going on nationwide called the America 250 Commission. And it's celebrating that 250 years ago today, in fact, the Revolutionary War was being fought. Okay, and so next July 4th will be the 250th anniversary. Stand Up for Idaho, in an effort to raise some funds and whatnot so that we can go ahead and continue doing these things, actually had this carved wood flag commissioned. It's a one-of-a-kind, and it's quite a unique type item. And we're raffling that off. It's $20 a ticket. We're going to sell tickets until, July 4th of next year, maybe the 3rd, but we'll draw it on the 4th to give away that flag. But this is to help us try to raise some funds to be able to continue to do this. As we all know, nothing is free in this life. It really isn't. And so it does take money to make all this happen. And so we'd appreciate you supporting us. Also, on the sense of the America 250 Commission, we have some ladies here that are actually out, supporting Stand Up for Idaho, that do a historical minute, actually a commercial, and it's on KID News Radio 106.3, and then every Thursday, like tomorrow at 5 o'clock tomorrow, on the Jolene Thomas Show on KID News Radio 106.3, they're going to get in and talk for about 10 minutes or so, give a little bit of a historical background, what was happening today 250 years ago, or this week or something like that. So we encourage you to listen in on that and support us. And I'll say this again, none of us would be here if it wasn't what happened 250 years ago, what our founders went through, our founding fathers, our founding mothers, just everybody that took us to get and create this great nation. And it is truly a great nation. So appreciate that. Before we get on tonight's show, next week is actually sort of we're actually going to have a pretty busy week next week. We had the local elections a couple of week ago, I guess it was now. And in Idaho Falls, the mayoral race and a city council seat 2 race, neither one of those got 51%, 50% plus 1. They didn't get a majority of the votes. So we're actually having a runoff election, and that election will be December 2nd. So next Tuesday, the 18th, we're actually going to have a candidate forum, and this one will be for the candidates that are running for mayor of the city of Idaho Falls. And that's Jeffrey Aldridge and Lisa Burtonshaw. Aldridge has already confirmed he'll be here and participate. We reached out to Lisa several times, and she has not responded yet. So hopefully that she'll see that she can come. But again, it's extremely important that you know who you're voting for. And Idaho Falls is a driving force in East Idaho. So I know there's some people from Ashton or up and down the valley here a little bit, Rigby and all that. Well, what happens in Idaho Falls does affect all of East Idaho. So it is really important to that. And I'd ask you to come listen, even though you don't live in the city of Idaho Falls. If you know anybody that does live in the city of Idaho Falls, you might be able to talk to them about who to vote for. Okay, and on the 20th, next Thursday, we're actually going to have the same runoff for the candidates for City Council seat 2. Now, that's the same issue, and we have Teresa Dominic is one of the candidates, and Brandon Lee. Teresa has already confirmed that she will be here, and she'll do that, no problem. Brandon reached out to him several times, but he's yet to respond to us. I don't know whether he's going to be here or not, but the same thing, as with the mayoral races and the city council race, what happens in Idaho Falls affects all of East Idaho. So it's important that people get involved. Okay, for next Wednesday, the 19th, which is a regularly scheduled town hall that we have, we're going to have David Ripley from an organization called Idaho Chooses Life. I don't know whether you know it or not, but there is an initiative, a signature drive going on to be able to get an initiative put on the ballot next November for the people of Idaho to vote on whether or not to essentially get rid of the anti-abortion laws that Idaho has. Okay, and there's an organization called Idahoans United for Women and Families, and the initiative is known as the Reproductive Freedom and Privacy Act. And like I say, its objective is to undo the Idaho's Defense of Life Act regarding abortions. Now, David Riley will be here, and he's, again, from Idaho Chooses Life. He's obviously against that initiative, and he's going to be here and tell us all about it and give us his thoughts on that. So I would encourage you on that. There actually are a lot of initiatives and a few things that are going to be on the ballot next November, that will have a definite impact on Idaho and what happens in Idaho. And we'll cover those later on later on in the year. So, okay, but we're going to you didn't come here to listen to me rattle and all that. You came here to listen to Ben Gisin. And I've talked to him a little bit. He has like he's 40-year career in banking, doing a lot of things. I'll let him, he's an author. He's done quite a bit of stuff. Throughout his career experience in lecturing, researching, and writing, he's accumulated over 75,000 hours of focus on our nation's financial system. He's going to talk to us about the Federal Reserve, banking, a little bit of this and that, and hopefully, and I talked to him the other day, and he said, help educate us on the mechanics of the system, which I think would be beneficial for us all. And like I say, money, power, and politics is what makes the world go around. And hopefully tonight we'll learn a little bit about the money aspect. And with that, let's give Ben a big hand and thank him for coming. Thank you, Ben. Yep. Yeah, both forums will be here. Okay, they'll be either in this room or pretty close to this room and stuff. Okay, we'll get his clicker. So here, I'll show you how to run it. I do know how to do that one. You got to turn it on. Is the ON. Okay. The little lights come on.
Oh, okay.
Okay. That goes that way.
All right.
That goes that way. All right. Thank you all. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and thank you so much, everybody. And let's give Ben a big hand. Well, one quick comment. We do live stream and record, and so there are people watching. If you have a question for Ben, please use the raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone and speak into the microphone like this, not like this, like this, but like this. Okay. That goes for you too, Ben. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm glad this is not rocket science. So, beloved hearts of America, welcome. It is my goal that you have more insights at the end of the presentation than when you came in on this topic. So we're going to talk first about a monetary system, and then we're going to ask the question, is it really a monetary system? This is a statue of Albert Gallatin. I put him there. He's on one side of the Treasury. He's actually a Swiss founding father, and he was a Secretary of Treasury for almost 13 years. So anyway, we're going to step into what is the monetary system. Now I'm going to read this. I don't want you to read it, and you don't have to remember it. okay? The system consists of banks, credit unions, people who get in debt to them, the U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve, Comptroller of the Currency, State Departments of Finance, Federal Deposit Insurance, National Credit Union Assurance, and the Bank for International Settlements. And don't worry, you don't have to remember this. So when we look at all these players, we get a hint that our country is tied to a financial operating system that handles the money function with processes of mighty power. So we're going to visit John Adams and coin, credit, and circulation. Of interest is how John Adams thought about, or what he thought about, America and then its financial system, and so he weighs in on the topic. I'll let you look at it for a second, then I'm going to read it. All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects in their Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. I don't think anything's changed. He was vice president under George Washington. He was one of the 5 people that drafted the Declaration of Independence. And during his time in Washington, the nation made its first attempt at a central bank called the First Bank of the United States. So some of my friends have been conjuring, does one person in a million understand what we're going to talk about? We've even got to the point we wondered if there was 1 in 10 million. So you're going to be the judge, and we'll see what happens. By the way, some of these basics could already be taught in 5th or 6th grade. So we're going to tackle some riddles of coin, credit, and circulation. And we're going to start with the two-debt process. So what is the two-debt process? Baffling to America is how $1 of purchasing power comes to be. We call it money. I'm going to call it purchasing power, and you'll understand later on why we do. When we think of how $1 comes to be, currency is the first thing that pops up to mind. This is often where our consciousness stops, and literally we're lost in space from there on. I mean, way out. As a young man, I trained to be a bank credit officer in a branch that specialized in agricultural credit. And I had to spend a month training in what was called the note window. Now, all of these processes back then were handled in the branches, and today they're all handled in the back end rooms, and so many of our bankers don't even understand how $1 of purchasing power comes to be. So this is where the credit officers go when they bring the paperwork of a farmer that just signed the documents. And so let's just consider a farmer signing a $75,000 note for a piece of equipment. So first one we did is we entered a transaction into the bank's books. We filled out 2 tickets. The first was for $75,000 that posted what the farmer now owed the bank as an asset. The second ticket was for $75,000 and was posted as a liability to the bank, representing what the bank now owed the farmer. And it never dawned on me at the time that I had just scraped the edges of a gigantic, moneyless financial operating system. So to understand more, we're going to travel again back to rural America, where our friends Sherry and Jerry just got approved for $1 million. And they go to their bank and sign a note and pledge collateral for $1 million. So as the farmers sign the note, getting in debt to the bank in turn gets in debt to the farmer's checking account. So the nation's purchasing power just increased by 1 million. It had nothing to do with printing or spending. So there are countless studies, scholarly treatises, and everything imaginable explanation as to what purchasing power is. And I've seen all the videos and I've read all of the treatises, and it comes down to this. Everybody wants to call what a bank owes something other than what a bank owes. So Sherry and Jerry can now write checks, use debit cards and other electronic orders all based on what the bank owes them. So when it comes to banks, there's no money loaned and no money in bank accounts. If people do not go to banks and get in debt to banks, the nation will not have any purchasing power, what is popularly called the money supply. So the big thing is the nation accepts what banks owe as payment for goods, services, debt payments, and making investments. So I had a book a number of years back. It was an American Banker's Manual, printed in 1936. I gave it to a friend and I never got it back, so you'll have to trust me what it said. So in there, the banker was chuckling as he was going on, and he says, yeah, America believes they run on money, and actually there's nothing to that. It's just what we owe that gets transferred. And then trying to figure that out, and this is what I would recommend for folks that want to get more into it or whatever. The Federal Reserve puts out a booklet called Modern Money Mechanics. So I had this thing for 2 years while I was pouring through it, and when I opened it up, it was just all Greek. And then finally, when I opened it up, I realized there was mechanics and no money. So the second a bank gets in debt to a depositors, it's counted as the nation's money supply, and the FDIC puts insurance on what a bank owes. And it's powerful and illuminating when a banker finally affirms your bank account is backed by the promissory notes and collateral of all the debtors to the bank. Your bank account is backed by the capital equity of the bank and by FDIC insurance. So how do banks make good on what they owe? When you write a check, what your bank owes you gets transferred via the Fed to become what another bank owes the person you wrote the check to. You write a check to a friend for $100. Your friend takes a check to the bank. Bank sends it to the Fed. Fed lowers what it owes your bank by $100. Your bank lowers what it owes you by $100. Fed increases what it owes your friend's bank by $100. And your friend's bank increases what it owes your friend by $100, and there we go. It is funny, isn't it? So the business of banks is to be in debt to depositors, and the business of the Fed is to be in debt to banks. So out of curiosity, once I looked up on Wikipedia what money is, and my gosh, they had like 5 pages like this of every cockamamie that you can imagine, but it never said what a bank owes. So you're starting to get the feel for a moneyless financial operating system which invokes, distributes, and extinguishes purchasing power. So on the road, there is power to the two debt processes of banks where purchasing power is born. There is power in how the transfer of what banks owe from one to another through the Federal Reserve. There are 90,000 bank and credit union branches across the nation. Each week, millions of debtors and their banks get in debt to each other, and billions of new purchasing power dollars are constantly gushing forth into the economies of our communities across the nation. And this is how America got the purchasing power it used to become a superpower. Solving the riddle of currency. So how does currency get from the Treasury's printing presses to your wallet? Some think government prints and spends. If so, why does the government have a national debt? In the United States, there is a firewall between how currency comes into commerce and the federal government. Government cannot print and spend, the Federal Reserve cannot print and spend, and banks cannot print and spend. If government needs currency, it has to buy it from the Federal Reserve at face value, just like every one of us do. So the collateral behind the currency is extensive and valued, I would say, even more than 2.5 times the value of the currency of the circulation. And that's published under the collateral statement in the annual reports of the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, step one. The Federal Reserve orders currency from the Treasury. The Fed pays for the cost of printing by increasing what it owes the Treasury's checking account at the Fed. The currency goes into the Fed's vault at zero value because it hasn't been collateralized yet. So a bank orders $1 million of currency from the Fed. The Fed acquires $1 million of currency for the collateral. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that tonight, but it's quite a spaghetti pot. Step 6, with the currency collateralized, it's shipped to the bank. The bank pays for the currency at face value by having the Fed lower what it owes the bank by $1 million. And so you've probably heard the term reserves, bank reserves. That is what the Fed owes banks. And so when a check goes through or they buy currency or anything, it's those reserves that go up or down. So you go to the bank and cash a check. Your bank lowers what it owes you by 100 and gives 100 of what the Fed now owes you. So the interesting thing, we think that it's printing and spending and that there's inflation that comes out of it. There are some things that cause inflation, and we might have time in the Q&A, we might talk about that a little bit. But there are two forms of purchasing power here. What the bank owes moves through Congress as it goes from one bank to the next. So that's a form of purchasing power. And the other is the currency. And so one form of purchasing power comes in while another form of purchasing power is extinguished. You put it in your wallet and no inflation. Coin fund at the Fed. Okay, our kids are back. They've been at the John Adams School of Coin, Credit, and Circulation, and they're here to tell us about the secrets of coin. The first step is people must get in debt to banks. So if people don't get into banks, there's no way to buy coin. This is where a supply of what banks owe to buy coins when the coins arrive from the Fed. So on a field trip, the kids go to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is a special Fed bank. All of the activities that the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, decides to do, whether it's raise rates, whether it's sell securities or buy securities, is all handled by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So they're the fiscal agent. And because of that, the president of the Federal Reserve is always on the FOMC board. Okay, New York Fed got orders for $1 million worth of coins from banks, and then puts in an order which the mint then orders the metals and the coins and all the materials, and the employees go to work, and the mint will charge the Fed the face value of the coins. So that's different than the currency. The Fed buys the currency for the cost of printing, but here in the Constitution it says the government has the right to issue coins and stamp the value thereof, to mint coins and stamp the value thereof. So once it's stamped on there, regardless of what it is, that's what it's worth. So the mint makes a modest profit. They lose money on pennies. On some of the other coins, they make a little money. And so I think the earnings is modest, like $100 million a year or something. And then that gets turned over to the general fund for the benefit of the public. So to pay for the coins, it's the same way as with the currency. The Fed just increases what it owes the Treasury's checking account by $1 million. And then the Treasury writes $1 million worth of checks to pay all of its employees and suppliers and whatever. Well, this is on the other side of the Treasury. That's Alexander Hamilton. He was the first Secretary of Treasury for America. So the Treasury's checks drawn on the Fed gets deposited to the banks of their employees and all their suppliers. The New York Fed and other Fed banks expand what they owe the reserve accounts of the banks that took the Treasury's checks by $1 million and lower what they owe the Treasury by $1 million. Now, the banks buy the coins from the Fed by having the Fed lower what it owes the bank's reserve accounts by $1 million And bank account holders, you can now go in and buy coin with what the bank owes you. So our kids have come to realize how our monetary system is predicated wholly upon the use of debt, a structure that may need change someday. They decided they wanted to make a difference in the world, and they pledged they would pursue education and careers to get senior positions at the Fed, the Treasury, and the Department of Education to get the education out. So how is purchasing power distributed? Obviously, the largest one is through wages and salaries. So of our $30 trillion economy, estimates are that roughly $13 trillion will be distributed through wages and salaries. So here's a key. Every person in America is a cash flow pump. Paychecks are received and spent. Jobs and wages give the nation's system of finance its primary conveyance power, or what we call cash flows. So in some cases, it doesn't matter what the person does. If they're doing something unproductive, let's put them in another job. But we don't want to go around and start stomping out all these cash flow pumps. Next is expenditures for materials and supplies by business industries and other enterprises. And like jobs, they are also cash flow pumps. Okay, so now we get into something different. Non-bank lenders. They're not a direct spender or a cash flow pump, but they're non-bank lenders, and they put purchasing power into the hands of people, business, and government so they can pump more cash flow into the economy with funding sourced through more debt. Purchasing power born at banks does not circulate fast enough or far enough to service the economy, and so non-bank lending comes in to try to cover it up by adding more layers of debt onto the economy, and it helps people, businesses, and government spend more to fill the arteries of the nation's cash flow. That's what we did in banking. We always studied cash flow, so I turned my attention on the nation's cash flows. Until there's a faster circulation in the economy cannot stand without further debt from non-bank lenders. Non-bank lenders use what banks owe them and lend it to somebody else. Most of us are non-bank lenders. With our pension plans, 401ks, and other investments, we lend what banks owe us to others, often employing investment managers. Our investments into bonds and other debt instruments are what build the largest portion of debt that the nation has. So as household, businesses, cities, and counties, states rely heavily on their investments, many groan under the debt they need to use. So as of June 2025, the nation was juggling $108 trillion of debt. We'll kind of go on those numbers in a sec. But only $15 trillion was owed to bank and $93 trillion was owed to non-bank lenders. So one of my favorite reports, the Fed's Z1 report, reveals the primary debt sectors in the nation. And so here they are, and how we get to that $108 trillion. And obviously the largest is the national debt at $36.2 trillion. So all of the national debt is funded by non-bank lenders. And then we have businesses, financial, state and local, and what's owed to the rest of the world. So we go back and we take a look at the trends over the last 25 years. And so now this is the total debt. This includes what's owed to the private sector and what the government owes. So in 2000, it was $30.2 trillion, and it kind of went up, and surprisingly, it was between 2015 and 2020, it went up 20 trillion, and 2020 and 25, it went up 20 trillion or a little more. So it's been accelerated the last few decades, and you can understand, we went through COVID, we've been through a lot of things. So to sustain forward movement in the economy, the circulation of coin, currency, and what banks owe constantly needs more debt to reach through the economy and accommodate the expansion of populations, the economy, and when we have inflation, obviously, what we borrow goes up. So, calls for change to eliminate poverty and debt are calls not only to change our financial operating system, but raise our consciousness of our social and economic consensus to organize around the arts of debt. Whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, that's the social agreement. Okay, now almost 250 years later, should we finally set up an education outreach that would make John Adams proud of us? So today the nation juggles about $3.50 of debt for every dollar of GDP, and 70 years ago it was only $1.42. So the nation is feeling peak debt penetration into the economists. And economists, they let us know the debt is expanding faster than economic activity. So the national debt clock started in 1791 with a debt of $75 million from the Revolutionary War. And the country almost paid that totally off. They got way down. But then when the Civil War came, today there's still $1.5 billion of debt in the national debt from the Civil War. So this uncovers a gigantic misunderstanding that somehow there is money out there that we borrow. We assume in error, if we stop borrowing, there will still be money circulating. And that is our problem with how we think and approach the problem of the national debt. If we stop borrowing, there's no fresh dollars coming into the economy. Dollars needed for debt repayment get even shorter. This basic understanding never made it into education, and our nation faces a debt paradox that cutting spending will never solve. So this does not mean we need to be frivolous, but we must strive and have the maximum number of people constantly employed in something productive. Otherwise, the conveyance of purchasing power weakens and causes the economy and jobs to start to shrink. So while the kids were having coin fun at the New York Fed, they looked at some of the coins. They discovered a philosophical concept to help America reach higher. On the back of America's coins is the Great Seal of America that proclaims the motto, E pluribus unum. The Latin phrase means out of many, one. It's 13 letters symbolic of the original 13 colonies. Here's the back of a quarter. You can see the E pluribus unum on top and the America seal down through the rest of the coin. E pluribus unum promises happier results. Okay, this is one that's rarely understood, is how does purchasing power get extinguished? So we always say, well, they're just printing money, but dang, we never thought that it gets extinguished. So let's see what happens here. So purchasing power does two things. It's extinguished, and it's also, in another activity, taken out of circulation. So we're going to go back to our farmers, and their $1 million of debt to the bank is now coming due. They sold their crops to the processors and took all the checks to the bank, and so now the bank is back in debt to the farmers for over $1 million, which is good. When the farmers write a check to the bank for $1 million of principal owed, the $1 million check represents what the bank owes the farmer. As the bank extinguishes what it owes the farmers by taking the check, the bank simultaneously extinguishes what the farmers owe the bank. Bang, poof, it's gone. So when it's gone, the economy looks for a fresh supply of debtors to get in debt to banks, to invoke new purchasing power, to sustain the national cash flows. So as the nation's 90,000 bank and credit union branches gush out new purchasing power each day, there is a reverse flow of principal payments to banks and credit unions that extinguish purchasing power. This creates a treadmill. Purchasing power is constantly coming into the economy and going out of the economy. So if the nation tries to stop getting in debt, we abandon the cash flows that sustain us. And yet, there is still another issue to this treadmill. It is in the form of non-circulating purchasing power in savings accounts. 2/3 of all purchasing powers in savings accounts that mostly don't circulate. And so all the savings dollars banks owe came from the two-debt transaction that gave them birth. As of June of 2025, you can see 11.2 trillion in savings and only 6.9 trillion in checking, trying to sustain a $30 trillion GDP. So this puts trillions of dollars of purchasing powers out of reach for debtors on the treadmill working to extinguish the debts those dollars were born out of. This increases competition for the remaining circulating dollars that can heat up to socially unhealthy levels and people falling through the cracks. This is why Americans call our economic system anchored in the arts of debt a rat race. So, as of June of 2025, banks and credit unions have set aside $250 billion for anticipated loan losses from loan defaults after the collateral has been liquidated. And part of that has to do with high interest rates. When you go from 1 year and raise the cost of capital by 2.5 times, well, then it creates a lot of stress, not only for little companies, but big companies as well. So the good news for depositors is that banks have already set aside funds to cover these losses. This is law, and thanks to bank regulations that require banks to do so, we don't have a surprise if all of a sudden $250 billion goes poof. That gets to an interesting thing. When a borrower and his collateral supports deposits, and the borrower defaults, and the bank takes a loss, so now all of a sudden the bank has nothing to support the deposits that were born out of that transaction. So they have to hold out of their earnings sufficient funds, and they'll usually buy treasury securities to finish backing that checking or savings account. And I think over the last 25, 30 years, banks have charged off a couple of trillion from and so that gives you an idea. That's tough on people who get kind of, work through that machinery. Unfortunately, I've been on the front line of that, consulting farmers that were in trouble for a long time, and I understand how the machine works. Okay. Oh, wow, okay. There are 3 purchasing power needs society has that conflict with each other. So we never think that there's a conflict, but they are. There's a need for purchasing power to serve as exchange in the economy. Well, we need that to keep the economy going. And then, well, we got to take dollars out to pay debt. So those two, one tries to make a go and the other takes the dollars out. And then the last one is the need for purchasing power to serve as a store of value, which is also extremely important. And that totally takes it out of circulation. So we got all these 3 things going that they're constantly trying to pirate dollars from each other. And so this is why when we read the news or whatever, there's tens of millions of people with below living wages, households and businesses, government struggling with debt, and most retirees don't have enough in savings. So while good management and education help, there's a larger systemic shortcoming here. The system constantly requires more debt in attempts to cover the shortfalls of each need. Okay, we need to take a light break here. Should we be grateful for the service the national debt has provided, so the shortfalls in these three needs are not greater than they are? And I know a lot of us have conniption fits over how big the national debt has gotten, and I understand that something needs to be done. Okay, so this reminds me of the story of a person who came in contact with an advanced extraterrestrial being. And a news reporter asked the person if extraterrestrials have a sense of humor. And the person said, they have to have a sense of humor when they meet us. Okay, so why does the world use debt? And we'll just jump right into that. So it started with the love and appreciation for gold, its qualities and association with the gods. So it was perhaps no accident gold migrated into the realms of commerce as coin after certain parts of the Europeans went and raided South America. So gold's service as a medium of exchange was scarce from the start. It often moved out of commerce to serve as a value of store, hoarding, or leaving economies in the lurch. And gold was so valuable, they even pirated their own coins. And you can see those coins over there, they're clipped. And that's what people used to do when a gold coin came. It was so valuable, they would clip the edges and take the coin. And then the coin would circulate, and the people that were issuing the coins were not nice when they caught them. So for every dollar of gold in the bank, there was a line of borrowers looking to borrow it. And so this is the beginning of the increased expansion of the use of debt. Populations and commerce grew faster than the supply of gold and mining could keep up. And then came the Industrial Revolution, which started in England. So this is key, because this now is going to get us to why we are where we are today. So England's gold scarcity for commerce to pay debt and serve as a store of value started to peak. With a history of using debt going back 70 centuries, it was no accident financiers began to embrace the arts of debt as a substitute for scarce gold and coins. Enter the Bank of England. This is the forefather of the Federal Reserve. And these characters here are signing the charter for the Bank of England. So purchasing power, anchored in the arts of debt, got serious on July 1694 with the chartering of the Bank of England. Oops. Today, every nation, let me make sure So every nation has adopted a central bank similar in structure to the Bank of England. And it's a system predicated not on money, but a grand architecture of who owes who. So how did this happen? England had to finance its defenses against its rivals, France and Spain, and it was either abandon gold or face invasion. That was the decision they had to make. And that is how purchasing power, using the arts of debt, came to dominate the world, because the first loan or the first credit extension the Bank of England made was to the government to shore up their defenses. That's how we got to where we are today. Welcome to Purchasing Power, Grand Design of the Century, and how America must come to grips with it. There are now some 215 central banks around the world. That's the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. That's where I was born, Basel, Switzerland. 63 of the largest central banks are members of the Bank for International Settlements. And they represent about 95% of the global GDP. And the Bank for International Settlements is the central bank for central banks. And its operational function is to help clear international payments between central banks. So this is interesting. I know there's a lot of discussion about how American Bank or the Federal Reserve came to be, but it's interesting that the year before, Uh, there were 19 central banks around the world that preceded the Fed in Europe, England, China, and India, and they represented over half of the global population was already operating under central banks before the Fed was put together. Now, every 2 months, the chair of the Federal Reserve travels to Basel, Switzerland, to chair the global economy meeting, and the Economic Consultative Committee. Much of the world's financial design is hashed out here. And I stumbled upon this, a number of years back. Whoa. We'll get back here. Man, that went fast. Okay, so I heard that the chief economics advisor for the Federal Reserve of San Francisco was speaking in Pocatello. And he was talking to the Chamber of Commerce in Pocatello. And it was at a time when the Fed wanted to raise interest rates. So here he comes into Pocatello, and you can imagine all these people in businesses there, and they're borrowing, and last thing they want to do is have an increase in the cost of capital. So this poor guy, he sits up there for 45 minutes, and he tells them how they need to embrace raising interest rates. So he finally gets done, and he says, "Are there any questions?" Everybody got up and walked out. Not a single question. It was just total quiet. So then I walked up to him and I said, "Hey, pal, you're not real popular here. You know, not everybody in the world is responsible for inflation, and you're going around with your stick and you're hitting them all. You're like a teacher that hits everybody when not everybody is at her line." And he says, well, and he tried to defend himself. He says, "Well, decisions that the Federal Reserve makes are not necessarily made here. They're made at a supranational committee, which is, dang, my hometown of Basel, Switzerland." So the law is this way. Because most of the world's financial design is hashed out here, the designs that they come to put together there cannot come into this country unless Congress passes the law. But then they lobby Congress. And since we don't understand, we don't know if something slips under our nose or not. All right, raising our Federal Reserve consciousness. So that's the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C., and it's called the Mariner S. Eccles Federal Reserve Bank Board Building. And Mariner was a prominent name in Utah. Some of you probably heard the name. And anyway, his family was pretty influential and very powerful, and they used to own First Security Bank. And Mariner, being a pretty bright boy, he saved his bank from collapse during the Great Depression. However, he got really outspoken about the failure of the nation's financial and economic leaderships. And so his board of directors said, "Mariner, you need to shut it." And Mariner says, "What are you going to do, fire me?" Well, they didn't, because they didn't know what to do. So anyway, a friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt came to one of his presentations, and he said, "Mariner, you need to meet the president." So Mariner went to meet the president, and that's the statue of Mariner in the Federal Reserve building, because in '82 they passed the resolution to change the name in honor of Mariner. So he met the president. Within a matter of a half a year, he was working in the Treasury, and within a year after meeting the president, he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. And it was a very important time in America. He helped America rise out of the Great Depression and facilitate financing at low rates to ensure American victory against the Axis powers in World War II, and God bless America. So what is not understood, and this gets into the mechanics and why I'm interested in the mechanics, is that there is a provision in the law, and while we talked earlier, there's a firewall that the Fed can't print and spend, and the Federal Reserve is also by law prohibited from lending directly to the Treasury. It can do it indirectly, but it can't do it directly, and indirectly is they go to the non-bank lenders and buy the Treasury securities from them. So the law said that in a time of war, the Fed can intervene and directly finance the government, just like our friends at the Bank of England in 1694. So he was instrumental in bringing a lot of changes to the Federal Reserve. And that's kind of an interesting thing here because we all think everything was established in 1913, and it wasn't. There have been a lot of changes since, and there's been a lot of changes since Mariner was in. So now we come to the Federal Reserve of 2025. So besides the basic operations of being in debt to banks, and again, I'm sorry we can't go into that. That's quite a thing of how the Fed gets in debt to banks and how all that's handled. It's not that complicated once you understand it's wholly predicated upon who owes who. So the Fed engages in setting interest rates, and starting in 2025 or 2028, $1 trillion economic interventions started from an interpretation of a 1977 Fed law. And I think, I don't know, when I read it, it seems to me there's some funny business in there. But anyway, so here's what it is. Congress has given the Fed 2 mandates. I don't know if you've heard of that term. And it relates to what they, when they get into and do economic interventions. The first one is maximum employment, also called quantitative easing, also called expanding the Fed's balance sheet, lowering interest rates, and it's called being dovish. And that's when the Fed intervenes when there's recessions, financial crisis, or depressions. By the way, while we don't have to go into it, I love what the Federal Reserve did after 2008 because every one of my friends and family, we all got our homes out of the low interest rates. The second mandate is called stable prices. That's what we're in now. Quantitative tightening, shrinking the balance sheet, raising rates. It's also called being hawkish. And this comes into play when the nation is caught in a state of short supply, forcing the public to bid up prices on itself to cause inflation. So let's just talk about that Fed, this purchasing and expanding the money supply to cause inflation. So the first thing we have to understand is the supply channels. And in America, I would estimate there's $50 trillion plus of deficits. 40 million homes in dire need of repair. Cars on the road over the last 20 years have doubled in age. Healthcare deficits, dental deficits, and all kinds of physical supply deficits, food deficits. So the economy runs on what's called just-in-time inventory. That means the inventory is such that you buy the banana at the time it just shows up for you to buy the banana. So like in COVID, when checks went out for COVID payments, the supply chains were thin. So what did we expect America to do with $50 trillion of deficits, except other than heaven stop me, but I gotta spend. And so this thing of supply is probably a bigger issue than what we realize, especially with that backdrop of deficit. Okay. So a unique disclosure was made that I had never seen before, and I came across it, and it was in July of last year. The Fed issued a press release after they said we're not going to lower rates and we're going to continue shrinking the money supply. And this was done by the FOMC. So here's the FOMC meeting, and the FOMC meeting is made up of all of the people on the board and 4 of the governors or 4 of the presidents of the 12 banks. They rotate through that position, and they sit down and they decide what happens. So they said, we are maintaining our restrictive stance in order to keep demand in line with supply to reduce inflationary pressures. And restrictive stance means maintaining high rates and continue to shrink purchasing power. So the kids are back, and of interest is the statement to them, keep demand in line with supply. It's everyday eating that creates demand. How do you push down the demand to eat, or live in a house, or drive a car, or live in a house? So the kids are going to write to Congress and ask their friends there what their take is on keep demand in line with supply. Are they giving up their homes and moving on the street? Are they not eating? Are they turning the electricity off? I think those are the 3 big ones in the inflation is food, energy, and housing. So to keep demand in line with supply, interest rates are raised to create interest rate inflation, contributing to price inflation. How does that work? Interest rates increase the cost of farm inputs, farm equipment, food processing, packaging, transportation, and retailing. So if we dramatically raise the cost of capital on every one of these steps, you can imagine how much is added by the time we go to the grocery store to buy it. And so the question becomes, how does this lower the cost of food now? So what might be the interest cost of bringing demand down in line with supply as interest rates migrate into the nation's $108 trillion of debt? So over the past years, the interest rate on the national debt went from 1.605% to 3.363, so it doubled. The interest rate that we're paying on the national debt doubled, and so we're going to use that yardstick to see, well, okay, let's see what happened. First year, it went up by almost 0.5%. We got a problem here. I'm sure glad he's here. Well, don't look so serious. We'll get this figured out. So while he's doing that, I'll explain to you how the interest rates are raised. The Fed has oh, it's already working. Wow, I got out of that one. Okay, then by the second year, we're up 1.365, 1.79, and 1.758. So we've more than doubled the interest cost on the national debt. And so what if we use this yardstick and apply it to all the debt? And we'll get all these debt numbers are from that Z1 report that the Fed publishes it. So the total of the nation in 2022 was 93 trillion, and that 0.5% added what, almost 34 billion. Next year it added a 1,338 billion, then 1,735, and wow, 1,000,009,000. So it added, if we use that yardstick through all the debt in America, it added 5.406 trillion. 5,406,006 billion equates to $41,000 per household. So that seems big. But what is the benefit of raising these rates? So it gets distributed into 401k plans. Is there something wrong with the mic there? Okay. So it gets distributed, so it's not a total loss. It gets distributed into 401k plans, pension plans, Social Security trust fund, bank savings accounts, holders, and the list goes on. So all Social Security contributions in the past were lent to the government, and so there's still funds in there, and so as interest rates go up on the national debt, so the Social Security trust fund earns more. So the flip side of this is the nation's economy struggling to help debtors pay the $5.4 trillion in additional interest, in addition to principal amidst thousands of store closures. And are we trying to make gains by squeezing the demand side of the balloon? How do businesses looking for customers feel about this? That would be a great question to ask Congress. How does our businesses feel about that? So here we get to the crux. Does the use of high interest rates to push demand down skirt the real issue of needing to bring supply up? And does the principle keep demand in line with supply assume the economy can't rebuild supply without high interest rates 4 years running now? This is the highest quantitative tightening period in the history of the United States that rates have been up. So is it possible America can get on track to keep supply in line with demand, to save our friends at the Fed from having to bring demand in line with supply? That is the challenge. Contemplation, we're getting towards the end here. So the paradox of the centuries is getting supply and its affordability to mesh. And this explains why there's so many calls for change by literally billions of people around the world amidst the lack of affordable supply and an inflation-prone system that too often defaults to raining high interest rates on the economy. Must America face two constructive challenges? So let's forget about all that stuff and let's look forward. To take productivity and affordability of supply into the stratosphere and understand the financial operating system for insights on how to change its anchor from debt to productivity and abundant supply. So bubbling on the horizons are signs of subtle but growing consciousness to build no-frill things with zero-engineered obsolescence. This is a big one. You're not borrowing more, and you've got things last longer, so you don't have to borrow more to buy something else or fix it. Create durable goods with functional lives that are 5 to 10 times longer. I talked to this guy. I was doing a story for a magazine I was writing, and he was a custom harvester, and he went from the Midwest, and he came up through the country, came to Idaho, and then went on up to Canada. And when we were talking to him, he said, I asked him, well, how come you use John Deere? Because that's the only equipment that he had. And he had 11 crews. So that means 11 combines, trucks, and tractors, and on and on. And he said, well, I cannot afford to be out from under a warranty. And he said, all my friends who thought they were in the repair business didn't make it. And so every year, I replace everything. Whenever anything comes out of warranty, he replaces it. So he replaces everything in 2 years. And he said 1 year he had 4 combines that the engines went out of. So that's engineered obsolescence. And you can imagine when we multiply that through everything that's of moving parts and stuff in the nation. And discover and develop alternate materials to help to replace materials in short supply. So this is a cute picture. This woman is the most famous picture of the Great Depression, and she became the poster child of the Great Depression. And to tell you how wonderful America is, a number of years later, somebody visited her, and dang, she was living in middle America. She had a home, she had her family, and she wasn't even aware that she was the poster child. So that had a good ending. So understanding financial levers and mechanics reveals ways to create special infrastructure banks to enable funding to annihilate all third world conditions in America with interest rates close to zero. Now, it's easy for me to say this, but that's how the mechanisms work. And if we understood the mechanisms, how they work, and if there was a mandate, there would be a way. So if a vision emerges to build strategic supply cooperatives close to large metro areas, supply will overcome shortages from whatever the unexpected events are. There is a powerful and high energy in the law of attraction and the golden rule as we march forward with a focus on supply. There may even emerge early versions of a debt-free financial operating system. The law of attraction. The world is a mirror, and into it, as you look upon its great creative activities, you may place there whatever you want to come back to you. It is impossible for anything to reach or enter your world without your attention upon it. And our Confucius says, that which you do not desire, do not do to others. So this is interesting. The golden rule is anchored in every major religion around the world. How it got there? Interesting, and it even has infiltrated the realms of philosophy. Who knows how far Americans can go with these guiding principles and a few stints at the John Adams School of Coin, Credit, and Circulation, and thank you.
I hope you're up for questions. We'll start back here.
Okay.
So what brings me to mind is what happens when they go to digital.
Oh, you mean digital currency?
Yep.
Well, the mechanics stay the same. It's still all of who owes who. It's just that you don't have a physical presence anymore. And I think everybody that's concerned is, hey, now everybody knows what we're doing. When we had cash, they didn't. So there's another issue here, and it's got to do with coins. So I know they want to take pennies out, but recall the Treasury earns seigniorage. That's what the profit is called on minting coins. And so the larger the coin, the more money the Treasury makes, and that they can put back to assist the public. So if we were to mint, say, a $5 coin, a 10, a 15, and a 20, and if we wanted to get away from digital and get back to the world where we like to feel the money that we love from our country, the earnings on that could be in the billions. And so I know people don't want to use coin and whatnot, but it's something to think about. It depends on what our priorities are. Please. Okay.
I have two questions. The first question is, you mentioned in Basel, Switzerland, that's where the Federal Reserve Board meets to govern all the other Federal Reserve banks. Who is controlling the Federal Reserve System from Basel, Switzerland? Is it the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers? Who are controlling it? And my other question is, how do you see Congress's role in coining the money supply of the United States under the Constitution?
So first of all, the Federal Reserve, it's 62 central banks that go there. And because the Federal Reserve is the largest, the Federal Reserve is what chairs the committees. And the one committee that we want to know the most about, they don't release their discussions until 30 years later. Yeah, so I'm sure there's a lot of sausage that's made in there. And I would have no idea of who's pulling the strings. I'm less interested in that because I don't feel like pointing blame gets us anywhere. And it certainly hasn't in my research, because if I'm concerned and I'm angry, dang, that's just what I attract, and I don't get far enough to understand what I was able to present to you tonight. So if we find out who it is, and if we can circumvent them with Congress or whatever the issue is, so I guess the question probably is for you to take a look at and say, hey, who benefits the most from high interest rates? We all.
Okay, we need you to actually use the microphone so people can.
I'm done.
He's done. Okay. Repeat what he says if you could. Like I say, we do have people watching and recorded, so it's important that we
So what
capture
did you
what you
say?
say.
And so my question, we're pretending like this Federal Reserve is some benevolent benefactor for us. And they're a group of thieves, I believe. So that group that you have sitting around that table
Right.
in Basel, they're not for us. They're for them, I believe.
Okay, so I appreciate the question. The point is when we understand the mechanics, we understand what they're doing, and then we change what they're doing. But until we understand, I don't care how many times we point fingers. Yeah.
Okay, next question over there.
So, in your conversation, you said you need more people working and being productive because this pushes the economy, right?
Correct.
But every once in a while, one of our precious politicians will come out and say, "Oh, well, we're giving welfare to the people because that helps the economy." Think Nancy Pelosi. So my question is, when they give money, whether it's 42 million people with food stamps, HUD housing, even Social Security and all this, they're actually driving up the price of food, health care, housing. And it keeps people from working because if you're getting a family of four in a house and they're all taking welfare, they don't have any incentive to work. So is this part of the government's plan to shelve people so that they're
Well,
not
I'm going to have to
productive?
agree with Gary here in the front row. So what happens is that as we go back over the last, 70, 75 years, every time we have a business cycle, and the business cycle is we go along and then we have a recession, okay? And when we have a recession, the economy sheds millions of jobs. So anyway, they shed those jobs, and even when we go back 50, 60 years, I tracked, it's actually in my book that I have, and that is one day 10 million or so people will wake up and said, we don't need you, get out of here. So they say, well, okay, the government's going to give me some, unemployment and other benefits. Then we have the next one. And then a few years later, we have another one. And so now we've gone through about 7 or 8 of those. And the last two in 2008, it was essentially this: hey, 30 million people, why don't you just kiss off? And in the COVID deal, it was 50 million people. So what did we do? We trained people that you don't have to work and you're not important, and we need to teach you how to suck up to the system. So when it's not tied to productivity and we're not keeping people employed, dang, we've taught ourselves how to do that. Does that make sense?
Okay, so if the solution is to increase supply, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of money is that it's just a proxy for productive capacity, whether that's human energy or that's energy for making a truck run
Yeah.
or making electricity. So the whole system really runs on energy, and we can't increase supply without mining new materials, running more trucks, trains, generating more electricity. And so if we have this conflict with fossil fuels and energy production, how are we going to, I mean, we can replace the human input, right, of energy with other forms of energy. This is why they're talking about UBI and whatnot, is that with AI coming online and increases in technology, you need people less and less to produce things, but we can produce things with energy and technology, and don't necessarily have to have people do that, but we can't do that without abundant sources of affordable energy. So how do we raise production to meet demand, and at the same time limit energy inputs, because some of the smarter than me people are assured that we're destroying the planet. Is that you following me?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I got to scratch my head here. I admit that energy is absolutely key. And if there were a breakthrough in energy, it would really change the economics of the world, depending on what the cost of that energy is. And so, I don't know, am I hopeful that we're going to have other source of energy? Maybe. But I'm with you. We need to have the energy that we have and use it that we have. Otherwise, that is a tripping point.
So this is, I've always thought in my mind, but it sounds like we need the debt to keep moving. My thought is there's probably billions or trillions of illicit drug money sitting in different countries. My thought come to is, well, let's reduce the debt, go in and let's start a new $100 bill. Say you got 60 or maybe 120 days, 6 months to bring in that old currency to trade it for new currency, which the drug lords and all them couldn't keep up to get it transferred in to the United States without raising a lot of red flags, and then just change out and wipe out that debt that they're sitting on.
Well, if you can find $37 trillion worth of illegal drug money, good luck. I wouldn't disagree. Hey, if that comes in and they can apply it, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, the idea of productivity, people who have disabilities sometimes are able to work and sometimes they're not. Hitler had a great idea of getting rid of them all, and he sent them up a chimney. And a lot of the politics in America is hedging in that direction. And, you know, about productivity, and rather than accommodation and enhancement to try to make the best of what we have, people that have disabilities, which may include pretty much 100% of us in some aspect or another, if we're honest. And so, in order to do that, do we include people and do we give them help in the way that we can, or do we try to cut them off and beat them and go to the, you know, apply the Simon Legree,
Yeah.
Judas Iscariot School
Well,
of Business Management model?
Yeah, I don't think it's any different than what we're doing today. Whether you're a retiree or somebody else, you're not going to be working from morning till night, and you've got to have some kind of a funding to stay in and keep going. The issue is that there is a disconnect between all all the stuff that's going on in the financial realms, Federal Reserve included, and productivity. And as all this stuff and all this spaghetti gets thrown around and going, we're thinking over here, and we think the answer is I need, I need an extra $1,000 in Social Security so I can make it, as opposed to, hey, I've got a car that lasts 200 years and I don't have to trade it in, and so I don't need that to make the car payment. And I know that's a far reach, but there is a disconnect between the productivity we need for everybody. And granted, there's going to be retirees and others that just are not going to show up and drive the truck, and I understand that. But they're included in this plan, and whatever that other plan is with more productivity, we're going to include them too.
Also, I think we need to think about entropy. I don't know if you know what that means. That's the second law of thermodynamics, and in its eventual state of inert uniformity that the universe tends to lean towards. But a lot of the wealth of this country goes out the tailpipe, up the chimney, and in the landfill. And if we made, like you were saying, better durable goods and sustainable things, then we would be getting somewhere, rather than, it used to be Northgate Mile advertisers said, drive a mile and save, trying to get them out of downtown. And so we drove a mile, and I don't know if we saved anything, but now it's a 40-mile racetrack around here, and we still don't, we haven't got a recycling place here that amounts to spit, and although there is quite a bit of recycling that's done. So, I mean, like, what do we do? Do we use energy from heaven, or do we use energy from hell? Do we have to dig up our dead ancestors and run them out the tailpipe, or what?
Well, David, I wished I had a good answer for you. However, I think one of the points that I want to point out is we are really facing a lot of paradoxes. And a paradox is something that goes, oh, well, what we're doing is creating our own problem. And so our industry is facing that on a treadmill. And what we do is we say, well, we need this refrigerator to run out in 5 years from now so that we can sell another refrigerator. And we need our cars to break down. And so engineered obsolescence is a huge thing that addresses what it is that you're saying. However, our system is focused on maximizing cash flows, which means we cut corners. And I'm not sure how we solve that paradox, but it is a paradox that we're not going to win doing it. It's not something in the long term that we're going to say, hey, America's going to be better off in 10 years when our refrigerators only last 5 years and our cars last, 5 or 6. So how do we get out of that when you've got powerful incentives to do that, and on the other side we pay the price? So I think if we understand the paradox and we employ the do unto others as we want done unto ourselves, we're already a step forward.
Ben, thank you for being here and sharing your skills and knowledge with us. I personally thank you. Now, we owe over $100 trillion in debt as a nation. How does that compare to other superpowers in the world?
We're the largest by far.
By far. Do you know how great the discrepancy is to the next country's debt?
Oh, yeah, I don't, but it's significant.
So we're hands down tenfold more debt than...
I don't know that it's 10, but it's significant, yes. Yeah.
On your slides, you were showing in 2020 our interest rate on the national debt, 1.6%.
Right.
2025, it was 3%. Who sets those rates for our debt? And how do I get a low rate like that?
Okay. Well, it's our friends at the Fed that set the rate. And so that's why we spent all that time on there. And the plan is to keep demand in line with supply. And so what raises demand? And you say, well, okay, dang, if we got a pay raise, we increased demand because now we can spend more. And so, yeah, the demand to reduce demand, dang, when you start thinking, your mind can go wild about who and why they want to do that. So now the Fed has what it calls the discount rate. And the discount rate is when someone or a bank or a credit union needs to borrow to increase their reserves. So let's say they extended a lot of credit and they can't make good on what they owe. They have to go get more reserves at the Fed, and so the Fed is the borrower of last resort. So prior to this going up in 2021, the discount rate was 0.25. Okay, it went up to 5.5. That was 22 times that rate went up. And every time the Fed raises, on average, the prime rate, which is 3% over, goes over that. So that's why prime rate went from 3.25 all the way up to 8.5 for a while there. So the question is we're trying to squeeze the demand balloon, and I think that needs to be questioned. And yeah, so that's what they do. So every time they raise the discount rate, then all the other rates follow. And then when they want to decrease the rates like they're trying to do now, then all the rates follow down, except in the recent time they haven't. So we run into another banking problem here. And that is during COVID, the Fed increased purchasing power by the tune of around $4 trillion. And what they would do is they would go to the secondary markets and people who are in the business of buying and selling treasuries. They would say, hey, we want to buy some U.S. treasuries. Why don't you sell us $10 billion? So the person that sells the treasuries gives them to the Fed. The Fed has no way to pay them. So the Fed says, well, tell us what bank you're at, and so we'll increase what we owe your bank. And then the banking system is used as a slave to turn around and increase what it owes the securities broker. Well, at that point in time, there's $10 billion more purchasing power. Okay? So from a cash flow perspective, if you take $2 trillion out and the debt that those $2 trillion funded isn't paid, well then, wow, you're like, and that's kind of what happened. There was $2 trillion taken out before the debt was paid, and so sometimes the markets haven't reacted the same and come down as quickly, especially in the mortgage market. I don't know if that helps, but.
I have a question on interest rates.
Yes.
Most of us, at least in this state, are capitalists, and supply and demand are set by exactly that, the supply and the demand. Why is it that we suddenly think that having this thing called the Federal Reserve, that they in their ultimate wisdom can do better than the marketplace? And extending that, 0% interest, why would any of us work again? We'll just borrow money till we die.
Yeah.
And obviously, if it's too high, that creates problems too. In my personal view, the more the government gets out of our way, the better off we are. We can make our own decisions about what interest rates are.
I know, but unfortunately, we have the Constitution, and we need to work through our you know, our chains of command, Congress, and so forth. But you touched on what I'm feeling as well, but I don't want to concentrate on it because I want to find a solution, and that is, this is the longest period that interest rates have ever been up in the history of America.
Well, one additional comment on that you know more about than me is that starting in 2008, Fed started paying interest on the reserves. So these bankers are now getting 5% on money completely risk-free, and that's a good deal. They're not going to want to give that up. They love that.
Absolutely right. And it creates a real sausage factory here, because what happens is when the Fed increased to pay the reserves, they don't have enough money to pay that 5%. And so they deficit spend, and they have this entry they make. It's called a deferred asset. So a deferred asset, it says that, hey, we're going to collect and pay this when the Treasury pays us interest on the securities that we have. So it's kind of like if you were to go into a bank and say, hey, I've got these houses and people pay me rent, and I'm going to capitalize, 5 years of rent and put it on my balance sheet as an asset. Well, you may, but the banker's going to laugh at you. So this thing that if you go by the way we think, they're probably, 200 billion, quarter of a trillion negative net worth, and they're waiting till they get out of this thing and lower rates, and then collect whatever's from the Treasury to pay the Fed. And so the single largest holder of U.S. Treasury securities is the Federal Reserve. And so this gets back to our system of who owes who. This thing is pretty extensive as to who owes who. And at some point in time, we're probably going to have to face it and say, hey, we can't cover our savings, we can't cover our circulation, we can't cover paying our debt. And so you have this huge economy that has kind of like a subsidy circle. So you got 40 million people that are below living wages, and they're subsidizing the economy because we're not paying them full freight. So the private sector gets benefit of that, and they're subsidizing that. So then the government comes around and says, well, to subsidize the private economy or the private sector, we got to keep these people upright so they can still go to work. And so we're going to give them food stamps, and we're going to do this and this and that. And then the government says, well, in order to subsidize us, we're going to deficit spend. And so that the circularity of what we're talking about here, almost everything is really the paradox of the ages, and we're facing it. And whether it's something that I'm thinking that, like, wow, maybe we need to figure out something that's predicated on supply and productivity, I don't know. But we're facing this paradox, and the paradox gets bigger because the minute, since we're all tied to this, the minute we stop borrowing and spending is the day that this thing starts to shrink. So we have to start saying, wow, we need to figure out how are we going to change the basis of how we interchange in our economy. I think this gentleman right here.
This thing going? Yep. Several years ago, I had some transactions with Eccles Financing, which owned Zion's Bank. And they were one of the big ones you were talking about in '03. And they were running out of money way before that, because most of the wives of the different bank presidents for Zion's Bank played golf. That's all they did. And
Happy times by all.
yeah, and now you look at the Zions Bank downtown we had here. Where'd it go? It just disappeared. None of the employees,
Okay.
and it's been sucked into to what you're talking about right now.
Okay, so this is hard to sort out in one way, but in another way, it's just simply the way we think. And the way we think is so when I was working at the bank, I remember they had a big meeting, and they brought all the managers there, and it was on a Friday night. And of course, this is years back, and one of the fellows, they had all the branch managers and their wives and everything else, and one of the fellows that was there stood up and asked the chairman of the board and said, "Hey, is the bank for sale?" And he said, "No." And then on Monday, the sale was announced. And so luckily, in the position that I was in, I was able to listen to my boss. Says, "Well, Ben, I want you to listen to the taped interview of the merger between the two banks." And in there, you could tell there was probably, I don't know, 10, 15 people. And without giving names, so the chairman of the prevailing bank that was buying our bank says, "You know, folks, you know my history. I let go of whoever we have to do to get you your money. And so our plan is if we consolidate the two banks, we'll not only give you all the money one bank made and all the profits the other bank made, but we're going to add another $80, $90 million to that every year." And so when it comes to our financial incentives, dang, we could be like a dog trying to eat her tail. And oftentimes what happens is the primary stockholders that owe the majority of shares in the bank that prevailed and the shares of the bank that I was in were one and the same. And so they decided, hey, let's just get rid of what we need to in order to do this. And so through the efficiencies and financial efficiencies and whatever, that has been going on in this country for a long time. And so banks are being lost as fast as farms are. They're being consolidated and whatnot, and that is our way of life. What are we going to do there? It's not banking. It's, well, who has an incentive to consolidate? Who owns the stock?
I'll read you a couple of sentences from the book The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffith and get your thoughts on that. The accepted version of history is that the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize our economy. Even the most naive student must sense a grave contradiction between this cherished view of the system's actual performance. Since its inception, it has presided over the crashes of 1921 and 1929, the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, recessions in 1953, 57, 69, 75, and 81, a stock market Black Monday in 1987, and 1,000% inflation, which has destroyed 90% of the dollar's purchasing power. Let us be more specific on the last point. By 1990, an annual income of $10,000 was required to buy what it took only $1,000 in 1914. So what are your thoughts on that?
I just don't think our financial operating system is sufficiently tied to productivity. And like I said before, when we've got, I don't know how many trillions of dollars of deficits right now, and our supply chains are thin, and every time that we have a cycle of recession, so why are we having cycles of recession? Then we raise the interest rates and it stops housing building, and then we go back around the circle. And
Could you repeat the comment?
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve System has created every boom and bust cycle since 1913.
I think it's important to understand why we want to reduce demand and not build supply. And you reduce demand by raising rates. And at that point in time, there is a strong correlation. Unfortunately, our friends at the Fed agree with that and say that there's a strong correlation between every time that we raise interest rates that we're risking a recession right afterwards. And if you go by that, yes, there's a correlation. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I want to get back to that, and this is part of Congress. You know, they want audited statements. If you go to the Federal Reserve site and put in annual reports, you will get their audited statements. And I can tell you right now, if the people that aren't reading it, they don't understand what's happening. So we have an understanding issue at Congress, not necessarily a disclosure problem with the Fed. And I can tell you all the spaghetti that the Fed spits out, sometimes I'm surprised they even spit it out.
We should have never adopted the Federal Reserve System. Congress is in charge of coining and regulating the value of money thereof. So it's really an unconstitutional entity that's infected our economy.
Okay, I'm just going to throw a wild thing out with you because I'm not going to get in an argument over that. Because the problem that we have right now is we are tied to this system up here to our necks. And if we're not careful with what we do, most of the people that I understand that talk about it, the first thing that they want to do is sever the key cash flow arteries in the country, and so that we totally sink just because we're angry at the Fed. And so the Fed does publish its reports, and they are done every year. And so, hey, if we don't understand, whose fault is that? I don't know.
All right, next question over here.
So you talked about maybe getting away from a debt-based system. I mean, I think it's going to eventually have to happen whether we want to or not. But isn't that what the BRICS nations are doing anyway, as they're trying to establish a monetary system based on production rather than debt? Because it seems to me like our government has just weaponized its control over the debt system to push other countries around.
Well, the BRICS system is totally based on debt as well. And I think what they want to do is have their currencies be the stronger dollars than the American dollars. Isn't that right?
Well, I think their main goal is to get out from under the thumb of the United States government, right? Because we can pretty much sanction and steal money. Like we stole a bunch of money from Afghanistan, we stole a bunch of money from Russia, and these countries no longer want to deal with us because we're not a trustworthy partner. And so it seems to me like those countries have lots of resources and productive capacity, right? China's the most productive country on the planet right now, and followed closely by India. We produce very little, and we pretty much have financial control and military control, but we're not producing the goods and services aside from food that the rest of the world needs. So it seems to me like those countries are working on trying to get out from under this debt system, while we're trying. It seems like we're doing everything we can do to preserve it.
Every one of those countries has a central bank, and as far as I know, they're not trying to get out from under the debt system. What they're trying to do is raise the value of their currencies relative to the U.S. government. And I'm going, hey, great. Why don't you raise your currencies? Your currencies have been so low, and when you raise your currencies, you can afford to buy what America produces.
So right here, what are your thoughts on tariffs and how do they play into this?
You know what? That's not my field of expertise, and I think your thoughts about it is probably as good or better than mine.
I was wondering if anyone had considered what they did in 1776 and thereabouts. They formed a nation with a constitution that's rather unique. They didn't start an anarchy. They didn't say, and they went through hell for a long time. They let private banks issue currency, and things went up. Like I know the Mormons in Kirtland, Ohio, their property values were up as high as property values are today per acre. And then it collapsed. They were like rats trying to crawl out from under the rubble. And that happened all over the country in that period. And other ups and downs and ups and downs. Now, maybe something can help this nation to even that out better and anticipate things, but
all right.
I think we all have to take responsibility and not throw rocks at this thing or that thing, but maybe.
Okay, so banks used to issue currencies instead of the Federal Reserve. And it was the panic of 1907 that was so severe. And I can tell you that from research, the panics that happened prior to the 1900s were so bad, and there was no really central source of reserves because it was all, and they used to speculate on stock and everything else. And so the regulations that's gone into support with the banks was good, but that was one of the key things that facilitated the creation of the Federal Reserve. And so putting all of the, the economic interventions that our friend here from the creature of Jekyll Island, all of that stuff is a different story than the mechanics of just simply transferring what one bank owes to become another bank owes. And so that basic process is more unpolitical. And yes, it is something that happened going back to the Bank of England when we went to the arts of debt. And so that makes the arts of debt more efficient. And so that's a separate animal than what we're talking about here about Fed interventions. And so in terms of, what would I say, the expediency that goes just from the simple function of the Fed being in debt to banks is better than, several thousand banks running around and totally lawless and reckless and who knows who can do what to what. So from an operational point of view, I would say this: given the fact that we're tied to a debt system, I would be very, very careful about how you want to disband the Federal Reserve, because you could really be cutting your own cash flows. Now, I'm not saying that's the way the world needs to be in 2050, but I'm saying right now, given those mechanics, you better be careful about what arteries you're going to cut. And one of the biggest arteries, I remember I was lecturing with a group of people that wanted to transfer the Fed functions into the Treasury. Well, fine. Somebody has to do it. So I don't care if it has Treasury on it or if it has Federal Reserve. Those functions have to do it if you're going to run on a debt system. And they wanted to bring in honest money, whatever that is. But one of the things they fail to recognize is that through our system of finance, one of the reasons that the U.S. is resilient in its economy, so there's this thing called unfunded commitments. And unfunded commitments are none other than $10 trillion. And the first thing they wanted to do was cut that cash flow artery. And that cash flow artery is unfunded commitments are exactly that. When there's a problem in the economy or a shift or something like that, there are these credit lines that we all have, that we all temporarily do, and that pushes purchasing power into the system. And so so these kinds of things all have to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, we're just out, and we're just going to sink the ship before we get into the harbor.
Another question? Oh. Who's first? Dave?
What time is it getting to be?
It's about 20 after we just count these questions.
I just want to make sure my understanding is correct. So you just tell me if I understand this correctly or not. But if they want to lower interest rates, the FOMC goes into the market and actually buys treasuries.
Correct.
At the next auction, and that increases the demand for treasuries, thereby reducing the interest that they have to pay. And then, of course, if they want to actually raise interest rates, then they stop buying treasuries or don't buy as many, and that reduces the demand for the treasuries, and then the government has to pay more interest. Is that how it works?
Yeah. So when the Fed buys treasuries, it means that the non-bank lenders have more funds to lend into the mortgage market, lend to the government, and so it eases the tightness. And in the reverse, if they start selling those off, then it reduces, and they're taking dollars out, like I said, before the debts are paid, and it creates the hawkish, so to speak.
So I might be completely misunderstanding what you're saying, but so if I've got a checking account with $1,000 in it, that means the bank owes me $1,000.
Correct.
They're not going to pay me interest on that unless I've got a crap ton of money in that account.
Okay.
So the bank hangs on to my money at no interest rate or very low interest rate, even a savings account. But if I borrow money from the bank, I'm paying anywhere from 6% to, I think, credit card debt interest rates are getting close to 30% now. With the central banking system, is that kind of how it works all the way up the chain? Is the interest rate primarily flowing one way, and does that mean there are a few people that are benefiting off the interest from all this debt?
So the banking system, their normal, I don't know, spread would be, is what I was in, is they needed to have a 2% spread between their costs and what they pay their savers. And after the 2008 financial crisis, what happened is that exactly as you said, nobody asked any questions, and now we can charge, and we're going to pay next to zero interest rates. Sounds like a plan if you're the other. So the other problem is when the rates go up, and I would say I've been studying the balance sheets of both the banking system and the credit unions, is that the increased demand for higher rate payments on savings accounts has dramatically increased when this started in 2022 and 2023. And there were, oh my gosh, so many credit unions, this almost tipped them over. And so you've just got tens of thousands of Americans that are on the other side trying to pay to pass through to the savers, that these financial institutions were just on the edge. Many of them have been, especially credit unions. And so they've had to, in recent times, in order to get their earnings back, decrease what they're paying their savings while they're collecting higher interest on their loans just to keep from posting a loss. So there's just a lot of spaghetti in that pot, and I understand what you're saying, and yeah.
Okay, hey, it's getting close. Want to make a last comment or anything, Ben?
Yeah, I think I wished it was simple, but the fact of the matter is when we go back to 1694 and the Central Bank of England started the world on a trajectory of a totally debt-based system, that system continued, and it was in the United States whether you had a Fed or not. And so the question comes, how long? And when we follow the numbers, like we are now juggling $3.50 for every dollar of GDP, and we were at $1.42. So we've reached peak economic debt penetration. And regardless of what our feelings are about the Fed and the banking system, this is a paradox that we're facing. And I wish there was a simple answer other than, dang, I think we need to have a school of John Adams coin credit and circulation. And if we understand the pieces, well, then we can do like the gentleman over here. Then we know how the pieces operate and how we maybe want to adjust those mechanics and operations.
Thank you. Hey, let's give Ben a big hand. You know, and I just wanted to lead on with what he said. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, the Federal Reserve, and, you know, I've read Jekyll Island too, and these type of things. But the fact is we are where we are. We may disagree with the Fed and what's going on and who's making what and all of this, but it's really important for us to know the mechanics, as he says.
I got one more comment for the gentleman over here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this book is called Beckoning Frontiers, and it's by Mariner S. Eccles. And the statement that he makes in here is, he says, the challenge that young Americans have today is how they're going to create prosperity and capitalism in a time of peace. So I want you to know all this whole central banking system that we have now as a result of war conflicts. Whether that conflict was in Great Britain, whether that conflict was here in the United States, or wherever it was. And so that was his statement, and we have to have more peace. But Mariner in here, he talks about the mechanics. And so I would say, in good balance to the other good book that you have here, try to get a copy of Beckoning Frontiers by Mariner Eccles and see what somebody right inside the sausage factory had to say.
Okay, and I think that's good. You know, and what I was going to say here is a little bit, we are where we are. But if we want to change it, and this is the wrong analogy a little bit, if we want to turn off this switch or cut this wire, we need to know where it's coming from and where it's going to and all this, because you may inadvertently shut off something you didn't want. And it's by design. And like I say, that's just a simple analogy. And so for us to change the system, okay, if we don't like the system, if we think the system is unfair, if whatever it may be, if we want to change the system, it's important for us to know the system and the mechanics of the system, so that we can know when, okay, I can do this, I can do that, I can see where somebody's taking advantage of this or taking advantage of that. And so that's why I really appreciate Ben being up here, at least to give us a little bit of a taste of the complexity of this system and what it really means. And I really do appreciate that. And Let's give him another big hand. Do you have another comment, Ben? You look like you do.
So for those of you that have other questions, I'm going to be back there at the table to answer anything you want there. We've got the book for sale, and then any other comments, if you want to swing by, I'd love to talk to you. And so we'll be here for a bit longer. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely, and I'll let you go there, Ben. But like I say, we do need to pay attention to things like Ben's talking about and all that, and it goes down to it's going to take time to change, but we need to be prepared and be knowledgeable about how to make those changes. And we may not see it, I may not see it in my lifetime, but hopefully it'll be beneficial to my grandson. And these types of things. So it's a good thing, become aware, become educated about it, understand what's going on, because the fact of the matter is, in a war, you have to understand your enemy to be able to defeat your enemy. And you have to understand those things. And so let's start thinking about this, let's start learning about it, and Ben likes the mic.
Okay. We all think the Fed is crooks, and especially as it relates to these interest rates and stuff. But I've read a lot of statements from other Fed chairs and whatnot, and some of those people really say maybe when it comes to inflation we should do nothing and let supply come up and meet demand. And I can tell you there's, ideas all across the board. They're faced with surfing on top of this debt beast. And I'm sure they don't have all the answers, but you know what? They're Americans, and there's almost 24,000 employees at the Fed. And they're Americans just like we are. I don't know how much they understand or don't understand, but there are good people in there. And if we just go ahead and just shoot everybody, well, then we lose the good ones in the process.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So, again, we just need to learn. Before you go cutting those wires and all that, know where they go to and what to do. Okay, and just real quick, next week's going to be an interesting week. We will have these forums whether all the candidates show up or not. Okay, and if the candidate that's coming, one candidate comes, hey, it's good for them. Okay, and we'll have an opportunity to talk to them. I firmly believe this. And for those of you that are outside of Idaho Falls, and I think you need to consider this with any politician or anybody who wants to represent you, whether it's at city council, a mayor, a legislator, anything like this, they need to be willing to come and talk to you in almost any form. They represent you. They're after your vote. And they need to be able to take your questions and actually talk to you. If they're not willing to do that, then are they really somebody that you want representing you? So just a thought, and I carry that on to everybody because our world is changing, and we need to take responsibility for how it is being changed. This last election, only 25% of the registered voters in Bonneville County voted. Okay? So that's terrible. So get out and vote. One last thing. So next week's going to be great. One last thing. Mark your date. Mark your calendar. We're trying to raise funds. February 7th, we're going to have a gala. We've had a couple of galas over the last couple of years. And it's going to be a semi-formal, formal dance, adults-only thing. We're going to have appetizers and stuff and just have a good time. Have some auction items and stuff. It's a fundraiser for Stand Up for Idaho. Mark your calendar, okay? It's going to be a great time. Everybody's invited to come, and it won't be too expensive. But again, if you like what we do, we really need your support. And join us on Rumble. Tell your friends, all that. Come and support us as best you can. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Be safe going home.